Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tracing an absolutely fascinating scholarly journey. We're going from highly localized classroom practices all the way to visionary global legal frameworks. If you've ever wondered how the lessons we learn in a community college classroom can actually evolve into a comprehensive blueprint for international equity and participatory governance, well, you are definitely in the right place. We're going to map out over a decade of research, presentations, and civic engagement to see exactly how these concepts came to life.
Let's kick things off with a question that kind of breaks the mold of your standard academic thinking. It really sets the stage for our entire exploration. Can law and governance be as dynamic as a jazz performance? Hold on to that thought, because by the end of this explainer, you'll see exactly why framing governance this way isn't just some clever metaphor, it's actually a necessary evolution in how we structure our society.
Section 1. Classrooms as Democratic Spaces, the Groundwork of Civic Action. To really grasp the future of equity, we first have to look at the practical roots laid down in community colleges and local eco-festivals. Before we can talk about global governance or jazz, we have to start right here at the foundation. Let's trace how this builds from early community-focused initiatives into tangible classroom strategies. Back in 2011, we see the start of eco-parks being used for education, which physically changed the paradigm of civic inaction. By 2013, the focus shifted to teaching social justice through the humanities, using incredibly powerful narratives like the story of Henrietta Lacks. In 2014, the discussion matured into figuring out how to actually embed democratic discourse and action directly into courses. And then by 2016, we see a huge practical push for open educational resources, or OERs, to break down financial barriers. It was all about improving learning while saving students money. This brilliantly illustrates how educators successfully transform their classrooms into living, breathing laboratories for democracy. Think about what students and educators were tackling together. They weren't just passively reading textbooks. They were actively analyzing how neoliberal economic policies affect food security in less developed countries. They were examining civic identity by diving into the critical, political, and legal issues surrounding public art. They were quite literally playing democracy and learning how to maintain productive dialogue, even in an age of hate. They were, as one presentation beautifully titled it, fumbling toward legal mobilization right there in the community college classroom. Moving into Section 2, Navigating Complex Global Crises, the Friction of Systemic Challenges. You see, these foundational, localized classroom practices inevitably slammed right into the friction of massive global upheaval. You can't teach civic engagement in a vacuum, especially when the world outside the classroom is under unprecedented stress. The scholarly research had to pivot, and pivot fast, to address urgent intersecting inequalities across environmental, legal, and health spectrums. When the environmental crisis flared, the focus turned to how legal scholars should analyze global cooperation, especially given the Paris Accord and U.S. political gridlock. When immigration and diversity became central debates, researchers started examining the alignment of DACA and data within the broader DEI gestalt. During the dual pandemics, the immediate priority naturally became maintaining equity in the classroom, and in the face of ongoing migrant crises, scholars even drew on literary frameworks, like Kafka's Migrants, to understand the rules of crisis playing out in New York City. Which brings us to a uniquely titled presentation from 2021. A chemist, a sociologist, and two political scientists walk into a cafeteria. Sounds like a joke, right? But I love this because it isn't just a punchline. It highlights the absolute necessity of multidisciplinary methods. The researchers realized that you simply cannot tackle these transdisciplinary global inequities from within isolated academic silos. You need the chemist, the sociologist, and the political scientists all sitting at the very same table, figuring it out together. The big takeaway here is that navigating these compounding crises meant completely reimagining education. It meant developing a totally new theory and praxis for a global civic ethos. It meant actively working to engender safe spaces for global dialogues amidst growing intolerance. It meant confronting the politics of legal exclusion head-on. And on a very practical level, it meant designing educational assessments through a culturally responsive lens, ensuring that the very tools we use to measure success don't accidentally perpetuate inequality. Section 3. Governance as Intellectual Jazz, a Metaphorical Pivot. As we move past those intense global crises, the academic focus undergoes a beautifully poetic shift. This culminates in a visionary presentation delivered at the Legislative Law Association in Jerusalem in December 2025. And here is where our initial question gets answered. The presentation, titled Participatory Governance as Intellectual Jazz, An Invitation to Methods and Other Troubling Discourses, introduces governance as something fluid and improvisational. Think about how you practice community engagement in your own life. Intellectual jazz is about replacing rigid, unbending rules with participatory governance that acts like an improvisational jazz ensemble. It's an active invitation to novel methods, and, crucially, it embraces troubling discourses, meaning it doesn't shy away from the messy, difficult conversations that are essential for true democratic participation. Treating governance as intellectual jazz is such a necessary departure from the past. When you contrast the two approaches, it's pretty eye-opening. The old way relies on exclusionary politics, rigid traditional governance, divided powers, strict disciplinary boundaries, and static rules that routinely leave marginalized people behind. But intellectual jazz, it thrives on fluidity and participatory governance. It embraces legal poetics. It's adaptive, responsive, and deeply, fundamentally democratic. This massive intellectual leap brings us to another critical question, one posed earlier in 2025 at a Law and Society conference in Chicago. What's a legal metaphor? That presentation explored legal consciousness and legal poetics, challenging us to use these concepts to actually fuel modern social movements. It asks us to seriously consider how the stories we tell about the law and the metaphors we use literally shape the reality of justice. Which brings us to Section 4, Poetic Visions of Equity, the Future of Narrative and Law. We finally arrive at the culmination of this scholarly journey, a major 2026 presentation in Portland, Oregon. The title of this Portland presentation is The Power of Representation, Narrative, Law, and the Future of Equity. Much like the Jerusalem Address, this presentation stands out as a powerful poetic vision of the future. Rather than just acting as an academic retrospective, it elevates narrative representation to the very heart of how we must design the future of equity. It argues passionately that the stories we validate, the people we represent, and the narratives we weave into our legal frameworks are the defining factors of a truly just society. It beautifully synthesizes everything we've explored today, from those early 2011 eco-festivals right through to the complexities of navigating dual global pandemics. This presentation proves that narrative and representation are our absolute most powerful tools. It centers narrative as a fundamental tool for justice. It leverages representation to empower communities directly, and it envisions the law, much like our intellectual jazz metaphor, not as some restrictive boundary meant to punish, but as a dynamic, equitable framework designed to uplift us all. To sum it all up with a direct quote from the synthesis, participatory governance requires us to embrace the troubling discourses, leveraging narrative and intellectual jazz to design the future of equity. I think that captures the essence of this entire explainer perfectly. If we want to truly achieve equity, our systems have to evolve from those rigid, siloed structures of the past into dynamic, poetic collaborations where every single voice plays a part in the harmony. So, as we wrap up this journey from the community college classroom to the global stage, I want to leave you with a thought to ponder. How will you improvise and use your own narrative to shape the future of equity in your community? I really encourage you to bring a little intellectual jazz into your own civic life, embrace those troubling discourses, and keep learning. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.